For I am a great king, says the Lord of hosts, and my name is to be feared among the nations. So, I would title this third question and the answer that God gives, going through the motions. If you were here 3 or 4 weeks ago, you know that that's actually not the name I gave in the original outline, but as I've been studying the book more, I've kind of refined my outline in the book a little bit. But this point I call going through the motions. And I remember, so I've been married, Alicia and I will have been married 9 years next month. So this was 10 or 11 years ago. We were at a college study ourselves, and I'll never forget this one time, this missionary that I actually knew really quite well. We actually had a history together. We'd known each other for a long time, and he was on furlough from Africa, and so he was at this college fellowship, and they'd asked him to do worship, and he did something you should never do when you're doing worship. He changed the strings of his guitar right before he sat down to lead worship, and he tuned them once. And by the fourth or fifth bar of the first song, it was completely and horribly out of tune. The guitar completely fell out of tune. And he just kept playing. And he played all the way through the first song, and then he played all the way through the second. He played 5 songs with the guitar, and he just sang to it. And I think in his mind he must have been thinking, well, this is how we do it in Africa, or just, I don't know what he was thinking. Actually, I'm like, I wanted to be like, dude, could you just stop and tune the guitar? I don't know, maybe he wanted to keep the atmosphere, but I wasn't so happy with the atmosphere as it was. So he played 5 songs with the guitar completely out of tune. I don't know if you ever heard a guitar that's completely out of tune, with people all trying to sing in tune with each other to a guitar that's completely out. Like the strings aren't even in tune with each other, and none of them is actually making a note, And so it was really painful. And I was thinking about that this week because I think it's symbolic of people that are going through the motions, because the truth is that you can have a guitar and you can learn how to make all the chords and you can learn how to strum and you can strum and tune and you can go through the motions, and all of the motions you're making can be perfect. But if at the core, if the guitar was never tuned, it is offensive. It is absolutely obnoxious. And these people here, in this day and age, and in our day and age as well, they were going through the motions and they were doing all the things essentially that they were required to do by their position and by the law, and they were going through the motions, but they were horribly out of tune with God Himself. And this is something that happens in ministry. And in the same way that with these people, it was something that happened over time, because as we've talked about, this Malachi probably prophesied in the interim of Nehemiah's ministry when he was back in Babylon, that when under Nehemiah there was a revival, and there were people who had repented and they'd given their hearts to the Lord, and there was a lot of really cool stuff going on. But within 10, 15 years, these people had come to the place where the priests despised God. They essentially despised His name, and they despised their service. And God is confronting them about it, and they were going through the motions at the very same time. They were horribly out of tune with God, and they were bitter at Him, and they were angry at Him. And I don't know if you've been in a place like that in your Christian life, but I can tell you guys that I have, and I've actually been in a place like that in my Christian life more recently than I would care to acknowledge or to admit to. It's possible as you serve the Lord and as time goes by, for certain glitches to be accepted in your walk and maybe your understanding and your desires, and then you find that these things you want aren't being fulfilled, or maybe things aren't working out the way that you want, and what can start out very small, like a snowball, a frustration, something that you don't resolve about something God has allowed in your life, it begins to snowball, and it gets a little bit bigger, and it gets a little bit bigger, and you might find yourself a year or two down the road actually with straight up contempt in your heart towards the Lord, even though you're actively engaged in ministry and you're serving Him. And maybe you're not even honest enough with yourself to admit it, and maybe someone has to come alongside you, as happened here. These people might have been really sincere when they said, "In what way have we despised your name?" Maybe they were being completely sincere. Maybe they weren't being saucy, or maybe they weren't lying or being coy. Maybe they were being totally sincere, and they're actually like, "I don't despise your name. I would never do that. That's not right. That's sinful." But the reality is that maybe someone comes alongside of you, or circumstances rise in your life, and it brings it to the surface, and you find yourself saying, whoa, I'm really mad at God. I'm not really sure how I got here, but I am here, and I need to deal with it. It's very possible. I heard an interview of Ravi Zacharias actually on the radio last year, and I've actually looked, and I'm trying to figure out how to find this one interview, because the interview asked him some really good questions. The interview asked him a question about this, actually, and Ravi got really serious about it, and he's like, I've never really, been so mad at God that I wanted to curse him. He's like, but I've had some quiet periods in my walk with the Lord where we weren't talking very much for some seasons, and there was some frustration there, and I think it's a real possibility. And obviously, just like with Alcoholics Anonymous, the first key to finding your place and repenting and returning to the Lord is admitting that you are actually angry with Him, because that actually is harder to do than you might admit, because we know it's so wrong. That's like a horrible offense to be mad at God. That's a horrible thing. I would never go there until you find yourself there, and it's a pretty crazy place to find yourself. And then all of a sudden it starts to make sense, His distance and His coldness and the lack of fellowship that's been there. He's been aware of it all along, and maybe you haven't. So they say to him, how have we defiled you? And specifically it says, by saying the table of the Lord is contemptible. So they had contempt for the table of the Lord. Why or how did they come to the place of feeling contempt for serving the Lord? I want to read. Uh-oh. I don't have the right book. I should not have removed that book. Alicia, do you see the commentary with James Montgomery Boyce over there for the second one for the Minor Prophets? Yeah, second volume. Cool. Thank you, sir. Good.
I can also stop here. Feng Shui was on. This one going further. Except that point.
I knew that one. That's why I asked. I just didn't want to point it out. So, just to give some specifics about what this passage is talking about, I'm just going to read you. Instead of trying to explain it, it's just easier to read it from the commentary. Here is Theo Leitch, on one of the best commentators on the Minor Prophets, expresses the priest's thinking at this point. Far from possessing the humble spirit which later characterized the great apostle, that's Paul, they felt that they were shamefully underprivileged people. The fruit, the food, the grain, the living we get from our job, the bread, the food we receive for our service at the altar, how contemptible it is. What the people cannot sell, what they refuse to eat, all the sick, the old, and defective animals are palmed off on us. And the best parts, the fat, must be offered on the altar while we get what is left. And what a weariness. Verse 13, to stand all day long and be ready whenever someone feels like bringing his sacrifice, to slay it and skin it and gut it and cut it up. A filthy, bloody job. And what do we get out of it? A few pieces of tough meat, unfit for food. Dissatisfied, they fault the Lord for conditions they themselves had brought about. And if you guys were here last week, that'll make perfect sense, because we actually spent a little bit of time last week talking about the fact that the priests were allowing the people to break the law. The law said that you had to bring an offering that was the first year, was without blemish, was not sick, all of these things about it, and the people were not doing that. They were bringing stolen sheep, they were bringing sick sheep, they weren't bringing the first fruits of their flock. And the priests were allowing it. It was their job to confront the people and say, you can't bring that to God. That's not okay. And in the same way, we considered last week that is one of the big faults in modern Christianity, whether intentionally or unintentionally, because it's both. There are churches where there are well-meaning people, and they would do this if they were aware of it, but then there are other churches it's very unpopular to judge or to actually, the idea of coming up to a brother or sister in the Lord and saying, hey, this lifestyle that you're living, it doesn't really match up to the Bible, and God's not going to accept it. You can't live that way. And so that being said, what's going on here, what he said that I think is absolutely brilliant, is they were blaming God for a circumstance, for a situation that they actually had brought about by their inability or their weakness in performing their duties correctly. And so I find that happens in our lives. But I see here in this passage three things that they were deficient in, and these three things were causing this contempt, okay? So they saw the ministry as defiled, bloody, and contemptible. That's in 12c. They despised their portion, 12d, and they became weary of the ministry in 13b. So firstly, 12c, they despised it because it was a bloody ministry, as the commentary already said there. But you profane it in that you say the table of the Lord is contemptible and its food is, the table of the Lord is defiled and its food is contemptible. So, as James Montgomery Boyce had noted, it was a bloody job. It was something, I think, when we read the Old Testament, we tend not to read a lot out of Deuteronomy or Leviticus, and so it's easy when you don't read those books to realize how bloody it was to be a priest. You essentially stood there, as he said, all day long, and you waited for the people every day to bring their sacrifices in, and you were essentially a butcher. And the law, as we're going to look at in a little bit, there were very specific portions of the meat. Like, say someone brought in a sheep, you could keep part of the breast meat here, the ribs essentially, and you could keep part of one of the legs, but everything else had to be burned on the altar, with the exception of some things that had to be removed. And so the priests were allowing the people to bring these lame and these sick animals in, and that's what he's talking about there. He's like, so your portion, your part of your job there is to get this meat, and you're letting the people bring in a sick animal, and then you're looking at it going, dude, I don't really want the ribs off that nasty looking sheep. But they were offering it to God, which is crazy. So here's the question. Well, let me read one other thing here. Sorry, you guys wanted an Old Testament book, so there's going to be a lot of commentary reading. This is a reference in J.B. Phillips' commentary on Genesis about the difference between Cain and Abel's offerings. And in the difference, there's a fundamental connection between Cain's offering and Abel's offering, and then basically false spirituality and real spirituality today, and that's what he's talking about here. From listening to Cain's spiritual errors, we can well imagine the kind of thing he would have said. Your religion is disgusting and offensive, a religion of shambles. Your gospel is a gospel of gore, because Abel brought a sheep and butchered it and killed it as a sacrifice, and Cain brought fruits and nuts and flowers, undoubtedly. Your gospel is a gospel of gore. It is repulsive to a refined, sensitive, moral human being. And what did it cost you? Nothing. Look how much effort I put into my religion. I refuse to believe my effort is worthless. Look at your disgusting altar. Look at it, red with blood, black with smoke, stinking to high heaven. Look at mine. Look how beautiful it is. Come and smell the herbs and the flowers. Confess that my way is better than yours. Then, and here is the paradox, then, possibly infuriated by Abel's quiet testimony, Cain, whose religion was too refined to slay a lamb, plunged his knife into his brother's heart. Thus he stamped one of the greatest of all hallmarks on false religion. It is characterized by force, by persecution, by the martyrdom of those who stand for God's truth. Before it was an hour old, Cain's religion produced the world's first martyr. Every drop of blood shed on earth ever since in the name of religion helps mark out the violent way of Cain. And so it is today. The very same people who in your college classes and in places like that would look at you as a Christian and say, really, you're a Christian? Do you sacrifice lambs still like they did in the Old Testament? Your God sent the Israelites into the promised land and committed genocide. You follow this religion of gore. I find it interesting that the very same people, they rally around a lady who, sorry, you guys were talking about Jimmy Fallon. The last Jimmy Fallon video I saw was him doing Donald Trump talking to Hillary on the phone, but it really actually was. He does really good Donald Trump, I don't doubt that. But I can't believe that Hillary Clinton can sit there straight face as though she's parading the protection of women's reproductive rights. That she actually calls it what Planned Parenthood is doing, protecting women's reproductive rights. And I saw another interview of a woman who survived her own abortion. She was the child being aborted, and she said, so you're talking about protecting women's rights, what about my rights? But the thing that I find interesting is that still today, the very same ideology that saves an entire acre of forest to protect some owl eggs, and calls us bloody, is the very same ideology that protects Planned Parenthood. And there's a massive paradox in that whole thing. And essentially, though, I'm going somewhere with this. Why is our religion so bloody? Because it is. Whether you like it or not, we talk about blood a lot. And Jesus didn't shy away from it. Actually, when the crowds got too big, he said, all right, the crowds are getting too big, and there are a lot of insincere people here. He's like, what did he do? He's like, I'm going to talk about blood. He's like, I'm going to talk about my blood. And so he starts talking about if you don't eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no part in me. He says, like, most of the people stopped following him. They're like, dude, this guy's freaking me out. It's bloody. It's filthy. But why? Why is it that way? There is a reason. There is a reason that way. And the paradox, it's found in the paradox of the fact that Cain disdained Abel's sacrifice because it was bloody, but then he shed his brother's blood. And there's an interesting truth if you can flip it over, because God is outside of time. The reality is that the reason that it is bloody is because the world is bloody. The reason it is filthy is because the world is filthy. And Christianity, through God's perspective, sees the world as it is and deals with the world as it is and deals with sin in all of its filth and the bloodshed and the blood on people's hands. It deals with it as it is. And so there's actually a very important reason why Christianity, stemming from Judaism, is bloody, because it takes the world as it is, and the world is a bloody place, and it's by the shedding of blood that sins are remitted. So, skip that. These priests had lost sight of the importance, value, and absolute necessity of what they were doing because of self-righteousness. The sacrifices became merely a symbolic religious ritual that they performed over and over again all day long because they no longer believed that they actually availed them of anything in the spiritual realm. And this is a very important thing. Part of the reason that these priests had come to a point where they held the table of the Lord in contempt, and they essentially were angry and bitter at God, is because they were self-righteous. And because they were self-righteous, they therefore didn't need sacrifice. Because they felt like they were good enough people and they didn't need these animals to be sacrificed on the altar, what happened is the sacrifices on the altar and their whole process became unnecessary. It became an empty religious ritual. And of course it would become the bane of your existence. It would become painful and monotonous and a drudgery, and you would see it only as filthy instead of what it was, and very necessary plan that God had instituted to cover their sins. And so that's very important. Moving on, though, the second issue here is that they despised their portion. As it mentions there in 12d, its fruit, its food is contemptible. Now what they're saying there specifically, there's actually something specifically in the law they're talking about. The Levites, the priests, there's very specific rules about their portions, as we mentioned before. We're going to read some real quick. You can turn there if you want. You don't have to. But Leviticus 7:28, we're going to turn there and read a decent section. Leviticus 7:28. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, He who offers the sacrifice of his peace offering to the Lord shall bring his offering to the Lord from the sacrifice of his peace offering. His own hands shall bring the offerings made by fire to the Lord. The fat with the breast he shall bring, that the breast may be waved as a wave offering before the Lord. And the priest shall burn the fat on the altar, but the breast shall be Aaron's and his sons'. Also the right thigh you shall give to the priest as a heave offering from the sacrifices of your peace offerings. He, among the sons of Aaron, who offers the blood of the peace offering and the fat, shall have the right thigh for his part or portion. For the breast of the wave offering and the thigh of the heave offering I have taken from the children of Israel, from the sacrifices of their peace offerings, and have given them to Aaron the priest and his sons from the children of Israel by statute forever. This is the consecrated portion for Aaron and his sons from the offerings made by fire to the Lord on the day that Moses presented them to minister to the Lord as priests. So all that is to say this, that they were given in the law, the Levites, the priests, they were given in the law a provisional portion. When a person came to bring a sacrifice, the way that the priesthood was supported, part of the way that the priesthood was supported, was that part of the sacrifice that the person brought was given to the priest, and they had flesh hooks. If it was boiled, they could dip the flesh hooks in and they could take of the breast and the right thigh, or if it was burned on the altar, they could do the same thing, and they were allowed to take that, and that became theirs for their food. And so that was part of their portion, their provisional portion. However, there's a trippy thing that happened. The Levites were not given a possessional portion, okay? They were never given land. And there's a very specific reason why God did that, and I'm going somewhere very important with this, so please hang in there. Deuteronomy 14, please. 27 through 29. Deuteronomy 14, 27 through 29. You shall not forsake the Levite who is within your gates, for he has no part nor inheritance with you. At the end of every third year you shall bring out the tithe of your produce of that year, and store it up within your gates. And the Levite, because he has no portion nor inheritance with you, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, who are within your gates, may come and eat and be satisfied, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hand which you do. And so the Levites were not given a portion of the promised land like all of the tribes were. And there's a very specific reason, though. If you'll follow me here, does it say this? In Numbers 18:20, real quick.
You say 18?
Yeah. Okay. Then the Lord said to Aaron, You shall have no inheritance in their land, nor shall you have any portion among them. I am your portion and your inheritance among the children of Israel. I am your portion. The reason that God didn't give them a possessional portion is because He was their portion. And so you have the provisional portion. They were promised provision. They were promised food through the service, but they were not promised possession. They never possessed part of the land. But they were given a person as their portion. They were given God as their portion. There's a very important thing going on here. So, we being the New Testament royal priesthood are pictured here in that God has promised us provision, but not possession. And we, like the Levites, can grow to resent our pathetic, petty portion. And please follow me on this. So we as a royal priesthood of God, we've been promised, you have been promised, Jesus said it in Matthew 6, that you would have a roof over your head, that you would be clothed, and that you would be fed. He promised you that, okay? But He has never promised you in the New Testament, in the New Covenant, possession. And this is where a lot of Christians err, particularly in the American culture, because we are very possessive. I'm not going to get into like capitalism pluses or minuses, but the reality is that to spiritual life, capitalism is very negative in a lot of ways, in the sense that it teaches us that possession is important, that possessing things, possessing people is how we define ourselves. It's how we find meaning in life. It's how we find life itself and happiness. And this is a great, great error. This is a great error. Be careful about this. One of the very first places in the Bible where this word portion is used, it's after Abraham returns from delivering all the people that in the Sodom and Gomorrah plain who'd been taken captive by those kings. He took a couple hundred of his servants and he defeated an army of over 100,000 people and delivered all of the goods and all the people and was bringing them back. And on the way back, the king of Sodom came out, and essentially said, you can keep all this stuff if you give us this. And Abraham said, no, I don't want anything. I don't even want a shoelace. Take it all back. I don't want anything from you because I don't want you to be able to say that you made me rich. And then after he leaves from there, then Melchizedek comes out and he meets him, and Abraham gives Melchizedek tithes there in Genesis 14. And then in Genesis 15, God manifests himself to Abraham and he says, Abraham, I am your portion, your exceedingly great reward. One of the very first places that it's used. It's important though, and it's a very much important that it was used with Abraham because Abraham was a nomad. When God called him to leave Ur of the Chaldees, the next 75 to 100 years of his life, he was living in tents and he never possessed any of the land except the cave of Machpelah where he buried his wife. He bought, and there's a thing going on there that the only part of the promised land that Abraham ever actually possessed was the place where his wife was buried. That being said, though, his portion, God was his portion. There's a very important biblical thing going on here that's throughout the scriptures that we as God's children, actually whether it's in the Old Testament or the New Testament, it's an error to look at this life and look at the things around us and looking at the idea of possessing things. It doesn't really go well. Jesus said, beware of covetousness, for the life does not consist in the abundance of things you possess. And I'll tell you guys are all at a point in your life where the world is telling you that you'll be happier in 5 years from now when you possess a house, when you possess a spouse, when you possess a car, and you possess a job, and you possess security, and you possess all of these things. It's teaching you, the American dream is teaching you to possess. And the more you possess, you'll experience all of these things, and all of these things essentially culminate in the idea that you will possess life, the life that you want. And Jesus said, beware of covetousness. Beware of covetousness. Life does not consist in the abundance of things that you possess. And there are a lot of disgruntled mid-20s, 30s, 35-year-old people who bought into it, and they practically sold their souls for the American dream. They got the house, they got the the car, they got the job, they got their spouse, they got the kids, and they find it empty. They're looking for their portion here in this life through possession. And there's a very important reason that God said, dude, it's not there. I'm not going to promise you possession in this life. I'll promise you myself. I'll promise you a person, and I'll be that person. And it's in him. He says to us, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. It wasn't just a cute statement when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He said, I am the way to the Father, the only way to the Father. He is the truth. He is the manifestation of the truth of our entire reality. But when he said that I am the life, he is the thing that you're longing for when you look to your future and you buy the American dream that says if you possess these things, you'll have that elusive thing, life. You'll have it. No, you won't. It's only found truly in Christ. It's only found in him. And when you find it solely in him, and you're concretely built upon that truth and that experience, you can possess things. You can then possess things. You can, as Paul said in 1 Corinthians 7, you can buy as though not possessing. Very interesting verse. And he also says in that verse, to the married, I say, you live as though you're not married. And there's some really important truths about that you don't try to possess your spouse. You don't try to possess the things that you do have to own to live life here. Because they always have strings attached, and they always end up possessing you. So I'm not talking about some sort of weird life where you never buy a car, you never own it, you just rent cars or whatever, or you don't ever buy a house. But if you have a root of covetousness that's kind of taken root in your heart, where you've bought the line, you're like, man, if I possess these things, I'll have life. if I could just get that house, or if I could just get him, or if I could just get her, or whatever it is, or that job, life. It's a pipe dream. It's grasping for the wind. You'll never find life in that thing, in that person, in that thing, in that place. That's why there's still a surprising number of Christian young people getting married and getting divorced very quickly. I know one person in particular. They work in a Christian office. It's a company that is only Christians. It's a long story, and we're always surprised at how many of the young people, Christians, these are all Christians involved here, are getting divorced within 1, 2, 3, 5 years. It's incredible, because and this is instrumental in why it's happening, though. This idea that when I possess him or when I possess her, I'll find life, and you don't, and you become disgruntled, and you think it's their fault when you brought it about by a misunderstanding, by thinking that you would find life in that person, you would find something really worth living for in that person, and then you just found another person just like you, or that house, and then it just really becomes a burden, or that job, whatever it is. Those things, they're not going to give you life. God says to you, he would say to you, I am your portion. And if you miss out on this truth, tying it back into what we're talking about, like these priests here, so we're believers, right? We've been called out of the whole nation, and we've become part of the priesthood. And when you become part of the priesthood, here's the thing. God says to you, hey, I promise you that I'm going to meet your needs, but I'm not going to promise you that you're ever going to possess anything in this life. You might not, but I promise you I will meet your needs. That was part of the agreement when you came to him. God, I just want you. That's essentially what you were saying. But the truth is that as time goes on, I've found in my own life that subtly the desire for things creeps in. You know, it would be nice to have a nicer fishing pole. I'd be able to do this. Or it'd be nice to have a boat. You know, I could do discipleship or whatever on a boat. It'd be nice to do this. And these things creep in, and they start to take your heart, and you start to think that you need those things. And then God doesn't provide them, because he knows they're not going to meet your need, and they're only going to lead to something worse down the road, you further away from him, or something along those lines. A lot of times he ends up not providing those things, and what happens is you get bitter. You start to hold in contempt the portion that God has provided for you, which is actually relatively small. Because if you're looking, Christian, listen to me here. You are part of the royal priesthood. He has promised you a very small provisional portion. That's what he's promised you. And you need to settle it in your heart here, now, that you will love him and follow him, even if that's all he ever gives you is your bread, clothing, and a roof over your head every day and night that you don't even own. Even if that's all he's promised you in this life. But when you start getting your eyes on this life, you know, a year or two goes by, or 5 or 10 years go by, and it's easy for this life and the desires of this life and covetousness to seek in there. When those things start happening, you start getting malcontent with the portion that he has given you. But here's the truth. He is the portion. You haven't been given some pathetic portion. You actually have the God of the universe as your portion. Now, I'm not talking about here like rags to riches. All right, man, I'm going to have a mansion, all that stuff. You totally don't get it if you think that's what's going on here. Take your eyes off this world and off the things of this world as though you could possess it and it would actually give you life as you possess things in it. It won't. Set your eyes on him as your portion. The only thing I need to possess in this life is you, Lord. And you've promised that sort of relationship. In Song of Solomon, I am my beloved's and he is mine. He says to you, in the same way that a lover says to another, I am yours and you are mine, in that Christian ethic, only that Christian ethic where we actually belong to each other. You notice that's become, basically, it's repugnant in our society, the idea of like, well, this person belongs to me, my spouse belongs to me, until they cheat on you. It's like, well, no, you were mine. You can't do that. I can cheat on you, but you can't cheat on me. That whole thing. But this idea that in the Christian ethic, that I am my beloved's and he is mine, that her body is mine and my body is hers, in the Christian ethic is incredible, especially when you take into account that we're not allowed to possess. And it's not about a sort of possessiveness. It's about the giving of yourself, free will to the other person. It's a symbol of our relationship with God. But he says to you, I am yours. It's a very interesting thing here when he says, I am your portion. So he promises you provision, but he also promises you a person in this life. And he says to you, I will be your portion. And if you found yourself here tonight, maybe as we're considering this thing, You know what? I am bitter. I am bitter about the ministry I'm in and where I'm at in my Christian life. It's very likely because you bought into the lie of covetousness and you started looking at the world and things you want in the world, things that you want to possess in the world, and you thought they would give you life, or you think they'll give you life. Maybe God's not giving you those things, and you're looking, I don't like the portion that God gives me. Well, you're missing the point. You're missing the point. It was never about the portion He gave you. It was about Him. He is your portion. You know, it's interesting. I think that there are a lot of people that they don't have, as Christians, they're ignorant of how valuable this portion that God has given us is. And a lot of people don't value it. A lot of Christians don't value it. They don't have any idea. I found some really interesting, I was looking up garage sale finds on the internet. There are some really interesting articles that people found like really valuable stuff at garage sales. And a lady found a Pablo Picasso painting at a garage sale in Shreveport, Louisiana. This is in 2009. 2009, it was a real Picasso. Of all the places to stumble upon an original Picasso, who would guess that one would show up at a trailer park in Shreveport, Louisiana? For Tisha McNeil, however, that improbability became real when in 2009 she paid Edith Parker $2 for a painting purported to be a fake that was signed by the master. According to Parker, she kept looking at this picture and said, well, it don't look like much, and it was this cheap little frame. After learning of the painting's value, Parker, undoubtedly disappointed by McNeil's good fortune, lamented, oh my God, I could have quit work and gotten out of this trailer park. You know, it's incredible how we can have something so valuable right under our nose. Maybe because we've always had it, or because it's always been there, and not realize how valuable it is. And I think there are a lot of Christians that are living their life and they don't even realize what they are missing by not apprehending this truth of the fact that this truth that God is your portion right there under your nose. Everything, all of the riches of life and godliness and wisdom in Christ that you have in Him as your portion. People living as spiritual paupers. It's a shame. Thirdly, and finally, they became weary of the ministry. They became weary of the ministry. Well, how did this happen? Besides the aforementioned truths, there are other reasons they became weary. For our purposes tonight, we just have three. Just quickly, I'm going to deal with these three things. These three simple misunderstandings really is what they are. These aren't really so much actions as they are misunderstandings that we adopt. And they're kind of widespread in various parts of Christianity, and they were at this time too. But three simple misunderstandings. And the first misunderstanding is that the ministry is supposed to be burdensome by nature. This is why they were weary, because their ministry had become burdensome. But the interesting thing is it was pretty widespread in this day and age, in Jeremiah's day in particular. I'm going to read a passage out of Jeremiah in a minute. That the people thought that to serve God, to be a prophet of God, was essentially a burden. And it had become essentially a sort of a colloquialism. They would say, whenever a prophet was going to begin to speak, he would say, the burden of the Lord. And then he would speak. And it was this sort of thing where, you know, and I've even heard it in modern day circles where people are like, it was just a burden on my heart. And I kind of cringe sometimes when people say that, because I'm like, that'll make more sense after I read some of these passages, why I cringe. Because sometimes, I get why people say it sometimes. Like, if something's on your heart, God's really put something on your heart and you're resisting it, and you're not saying it, you know, maybe it's to like a loved one or something, and it's a sort of a thing where it's like, week after week, God's been putting it on your heart, and you keep resisting. Yeah, it actually can become a burden on your heart, like, you really need to do this. And so I get where there's a legitimate place for it to be used, and I think that that's kind of what maybe some of the prophets started using, but it became a very common way to segue into a prophecy, and particularly in the 5th century BC. You see it a lot in Jeremiah's book and some of the other prophecies. It was just how they would, you know, now if you go to like a Pentecostal church and someone's going to prophesy, they usually start out with, my little children, or, something along those lines. Oh, here comes the prophecy, And but in that day and age, they really got into this habit of saying the burden of the Lord. Now, I'm actually going to read this to you in the King James Version, and there's a very important reason why I'm going to do that. I don't generally read out of the King James Version. I prefer the New King James. But I need to give you a brief explanation of why I'm going to read you this passage out of the King James Version, because the King James Version is even more correct than the New King James Version. And the reason this is because the King James Version is a literal translation. Now, the New King James Version is also a literal translation, but the difference is that they chose to take the words in the Hebrew that are translated burden, and they literally mean burden. It's not rocket science, it means burden. And they chose to translate it oracle, which means wise saying, or the prophecy is the idea there. Now, if you have an NIV, I wouldn't encourage you to read along because it's not even going to read the same way. And there's a very important reason why it's not going to read the same way, because the NIV, it's not primarily because the NIV was translated from the majority text and the New King James and the King James were translated from the minority text. That's not the reason it's going to read differently. The reason it's going to read differently is because the NIV is called a dynamic translation. And what that means is the translators, they didn't translate word for word as they did with the New King James, the King James, and the NASB. They translated thought for thought. And whenever they came across a thought or a phrase in the passage, and they said, you know what, that's not really going to make sense to the people who are reading it in 2015, the burden of the Lord, they're not going to know what that means. So we're going to translate it as the wise saying of the Lord, even though that's not literally what it's saying in the Hebrew. So are you following me? That's what a dynamic translation means. It's why I don't prefer the NIV, because whether you realize it or not, you're reading a commentary. You're not straight reading the Bible, which is fine as long as you realize you're essentially reading a commentary. You're reading what someone thinks the passage means, not literally what it was saying. So I wouldn't bother trying to read along in NIV. You're just going to be like, what in the world? Because it essentially says something almost completely different. It's translated very differently because it's a dynamic translation. And this is very important because this is a very misunderstood passage unless you read it literally and with a word-for-word translation. It actually makes sense. So this is the King James Version. Jeremiah 23:33. And when this people, or prophet, or a priest shall ask thee, saying, what is the burden of the Lord? Thou shalt say unto them, what burden? I will even forsake you, saith the Lord. And I like the Latin Vulgate here. The Latin Vulgate actually says, you are the burden. But in verse 34, and as for the prophet and the priest and the people that shall say, the burden of the Lord, I will even punish that man and his house. Thus shall ye say, every one to his neighbor, and every one to his brother, what hath the Lord answered, and what hath the Lord spoken? So here in verse 35, he's saying, essentially what he's getting at here is he's saying, I don't want you to use this saying anymore. I'm sick of you using this saying, the burden of the Lord. And there's a reason, and we'll get into it in a minute. And so he's saying, thus shall ye say, every one to his neighbor, and every one to his brother, what hath the Lord answered, and what hath the Lord spoken? And the burden of the Lord shall ye mention no more, for every man's word shall be his burden. For ye have perverted the words of the living God, the Lord of hosts, our God. Thus shalt thou say to the prophet, what hath the Lord answered thee, and what hath the Lord spoken? So all he's essentially saying is, I want you to replace this. I want you to stop saying, what's the burden of the Lord, or this is the burden of the Lord, and just say, this is what God's saying, or what did God say? Stop saying that is what he's saying. But since ye say the burden of the Lord, therefore thus saith the Lord, because you say this word, the burden of the Lord, and I have sent unto you, saying, ye shall not say the burden of the Lord. Therefore, behold, I, even I, will utterly forget you, and will forsake you, and the city that I gave you and your fathers, and cast you out of my presence. And I will bring an everlasting reproach upon you, and a perpetual shame, which shall not be forgotten. Now, just a clarification. I taught Jeremiah a while ago back, and you need to understand this. If you were to pick up here and just read Jeremiah, you'll find in later chapters after this, Jeremiah using the words, the burden of the Lord. The reason that is because Jeremiah's prophecies, chapter by chapter, are not compiled in chronological order. And so you'll find prophecies that were actually earlier, later in the book, and vice versa. So that's important that you understand this. God was not actually correcting Jeremiah here. He was correcting a lot of the false prophets around Jeremiah, who apparently had heard Jeremiah prophesy, And so they're like, oh, well, so when Jeremiah prophesies, he says the burden of the Lord, so we're going to say that. But what had happened is everybody started saying it. And when everybody started saying it, it started settling into the social consciousness of the people that when God moves upon a person, it's burdensome. And this is where it became insidious, because this is a truth that, particularly when you take in light of the New Testament, we know is flat out wrong. We understand from the New Testament that Jesus said to the people, come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my burden upon you, for it's essentially light. Okay? This is very important, because to God, this idea here of laboring for Him or ministering for Him being burdensome, it is really a disgusting thing, because what happens is when a people takes it to heart and they begin to believe that, inevitably it gives place for them to be burdened by it. And let me make this really clear. If you want to know a really easy way of determining if something is from the Lord is if it's a burden, it's probably not from the Lord. Now, as I mentioned before, if there's something on your heart over week after week after week after week that you're supposed to say to somebody and you're not saying it, there's going to come a point where it's kind of a burden because you're walking out of the Lord's will. But if you're walking in the Lord's will, His burden, His yoke is easy and His burden is light. It's not going to be a heavy burden upon you, and God does not like this concept, because the truth is that in the churches that really teach this, and actually I'm old enough to remember growing up in a church where this was kind of a big thing, and the pastors were always saying it like, oh, this word that I have for you guys this Sunday morning, it's a burden on my soul, and it was just something that everybody said. It really meant it was weighty or whatever. But the reality is that when this seeps into the mindset of a people that serving God is burdensome, people get weary because they take burdens upon themselves that are not God's ministry and are not His calling on their life, and it inevitably leads to death. So, secondly, the second simple misunderstanding is that the ministry is supposed to be uncomfortable and make you sweat, essentially. Ezekiel 44, if you want to turn there. (17 through 18). Ezekiel 44. Uh-oh. Oh, there it is. And it shall be, whenever they, the priests, enter the gates of the inner court, they shall put on linen garments. No wool shall come upon them while they minister within the gates of the inner court or within the house. Wool is, I don't know if you've ever accidentally put a wool sweater on without an undershirt. It's really uncomfortable. But it's not only really uncomfortable, wool really makes you hot because it reflects the heat. So he says here, they shall have linen turbans on their heads and linen trousers on their bodies. They shall not clothe themselves with anything that causes sweat. You'll notice that anything that causes is in italics because it's not there. A very interesting phrase here. They shall not clothe themselves with sweat. God takes, as other places say, another place in the Old Testament says that God has no pleasure in the legs of a man. It means God has no pleasure in man's strength. It doesn't impress Him. Wow, you can squat 500 pounds. Whoop-de-doo, He takes no pleasure in the legs of a man. This same idea here is He takes no pleasure in man's effort. It's not impressive. Man's effort in and of itself is not impressive. A heart devoted to Him is impressive, but our physical effort's not impressive. And this simple misunderstanding about ministry is that ministry is supposed to be uncomfortable, like wearing wool, or hot, like wearing wool, that it's supposed to be strenuous and uncomfortable. This is a very simple misunderstanding that creeps into people's minds today. I guarantee you, every single one of you, if you're a real Christian, you follow the Lord for any length of time, you've been confronted with a choice to go 1, 2, 3, 5, or 10 directions, and you looked at all 10 directions or 3 directions, and you say, which one would God want me to take? And in the back of your mind, there was a thought that said, which is the most painful? Yeah, that's the one God would want me to take. Which one would be the most miserable, the most uncomfortable? oh, it's Africa for sure, that's where I gotta go, or whatever. And I'm not saying that he'll never lead you to a place that's difficult, but he'll be your strength, and the burden there will be light. So please understand this. It's a simple misunderstanding that ministering before the Lord and to the Lord has to be uncomfortable and strenuous or hot and make you sweat. But God says, I don't want the people who minister before me to be wearing wool. I want them comfortable and I want them cool. Very important truth there. And then finally here, and we're finished with this point, this third one of the third point, they become weary of the ministry. The ministry is supposed to be all-consuming. This is a very simple misunderstanding. This is probably the one that I see in our circle of believers more than the other ones, where there are people who they give so much to the ministry that it consumes other things in their life. It consumes their kids, their wives, their family. It even can consume their relationship with God, as was happening here in Malachi's day. These people going through the motions in this ministry, this dead religious service that they were doing that had no relationship in it and had lost the meaning and the reason for it because of their self-righteousness, this thing that they were doing, it was consuming. It was consuming other things in their life, and in particular it was consuming their relationship with God. It was consuming it to the point where it was just dead ritual and there was no relationship with God. They were angry at God. They were bitter. They held him in contempt. They held his table in contempt and they thought it was defiled. This is something that happens a lot today. Particularly you get a workaholic, a person that's predisposed towards being a workaholic, and you put them in Christian service, and now they have a sort of an absolute divine mandate to be a workaholic and to ignore their family and to work too hard. And we have to be careful of that because it's an easy thing to do. I was thinking as I was doing this study, a lot of this is Old Testament, but that's what you guys wanted, so we're doing Old Testament. I was thinking about Eli's sons, and Aaron's sons. And both of them had two sons that were complete morons, and I can't help but as I think about that these guys were probably so engaged with the service that at some point there was a disconnect with their children, and it literally, actually, in the case of Aaron's sons, it consumed them. It literally consumed them. Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you for Malachi, and I pray that the things that we've considered tonight, there's a point in particular that is very convicting to me, and I pray for all of us, Lord, that we would be doers of the word, that you would give us the strength to do those things that we are convicted of and those truths that we know pertain to us at this point in our life, Lord. I ask for strength and courage. In Jesus' name, amen.